Welcome back to the Misdiagnosed Podcast. I'm your host, Caitlin Pyle. Today we're talking about hysteria. I thought it was appropriate because this is probably the biggest example of a so-called mental disorder, in air quotes, that was completely BS, but it was believed to be a real thing for more than 2,000 years. And I recently had a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, say that they believe in science. And I haven't brought this to their attention yet. Not that they really care, but this was science for a very long time. And this was information that was used to influence medical textbooks for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. One of those books was written by someone whose name you're definitely going to recognize, Aristotle. All this started a very long ass time ago. It stemmed from people accepting that day's version of men in white coats, their opinions were facts, when they were the very furthest thing from it. But because they were respected in society, which philosophers were some of the most respected people in society at the time, like Aristotle. He was a very heralded philosopher. He's a founder of logic and ethics. He wrote in the 4th century BC, 400 years before Christ, in his book On the Generation of Animals. He said, I quote, "We should look upon the female state as being, as it were, a deformity." Now, this is a book that went on to, as I said, inform medical textbooks as late as the 1700s. Here we are 400 years before Jesus walked the earth, right? A philosopher wrote a book that was used to write medical textbooks as late as the 1700s. These Greeks were very influential to our supposedly modern and democratic societies now. What people don't seem to realize, myself included, this is stuff that I've only uncovered in the last 4 years, and of course in researching hysteria and reading about it in books, watching YouTube videos, all about the history, understanding of it. People don't realize that legacy, so to speak, of those beliefs have an impact on us even today and how that's happening. That's what we're going to talk about today. Here's another quote from Aristotle, giving you an even clearer perspective of how his ideas influenced society's treatment and how they considered women. He said, "Men have more teeth than women. The female is, as it were, a mutilated male. Females are weaker and colder in nature. Compared to men, women are immature, deficient, deformed. They are even a bit monstrous. Men have hotter blood than women, a more important role in reproduction, and are generally more perfect." I can't make this stuff up. According to Aristotle, women played a passive role in reproduction. They were basically the providers of the bloody, soft bed that was necessary for man's creation, their semen, to magically grow into a human being. This is what he believed. He believed that women were basically a bed and that sperm contained in semen grew by itself into a human being. He didn't know about the egg, so he didn't acknowledge it, of course. This is the guy, these writings from the 4th century BC informed medical texts as late as the 1700s. Now, making the connection between those textbooks and the textbooks of today, where do you think the textbooks of today were informed? From probably the textbooks of the 1700s, in large part. So it doesn't just stop. It's not like they decided that Aristotle was wrong in the 1700s. Obviously, he's still been very influential in the medical industry. And then there's also another influential Greek. I'm sure you've heard of him, Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. He was a little bit closer to the truth than Aristotle, because to Aristotle, women were never more than homemakers. He didn't know that we had eggs that were fertilized by sperm, and together it became a human being. Hippocrates was a little bit more right. He believed that a woman's period purged her of bad humors. Some people still believe that, actually, that the monthly bleed is cleansing for the body. I don't think that the period purges us of bad humors, but it certainly is a time of cleansing, and something that I'm working on in my personal journey of health is to honor my monthly cycle. And that's a big reason why I decided to do this episode on hysteria, following the episode on bipolar, because bipolar in many ways is the new hysteria. And we'll get into a little bit about why I think that as we go into this episode, it'll become more clear. But in realizing that the innate cycle of our bodies means that sometimes we feel certain ways in certain times of the month. Like 80% of the body's immune system works to protect the reproductive system during menstruation. I didn't know that until like 2 months ago. And that takes a lot of energy. And so if we ignore the fact that we're on our periods and push ourselves to do the same level of workouts that we might do in other times of the month that probably feel great to us, and we push ourselves without realizing what our bodies are actually going through, then we actually hurt ourselves and put stress on our bodies that can lead to disease and disorder physically. So yeah, Hippocrates believed that every month when we had a period, we were purging ourselves of bad humors. He also theorized that the blood we released relieved us of toxins and other causes of disease. So that has carried on. People still believe that. And the body does have its own innate cleansing system. And so he was not totally wrong, right? He was more right than Aristotle. But his theories, this is how it can get bad, right? Theories were taken way too far. Not enough research done. His theories eventually led to the practice of bloodletting. You may recall from a previous episode where I touched on it, Benjamin Rush, the father of psychiatry, killed a lot of people by bleeding them to death. And he's still considered the father of American psychiatry. He was a murderer. But he's considered the father of American psychiatry. Bloodletting in both sexes, not just females, it lasted nearly 2,000 years by itself, that practice, believing that you just had to like randomly let out, like there was something wrong with the blood and had to let it out. It's very similar to today's just take a pill because there's a chemical imbalance, right? That chemical imbalance theory that is not true. In bloodletting, they couldn't tell that there was anything wrong. They just randomly decided to let a whole bunch of blood out and hope that things got better when it was really making things worse. Just taking a pill to correct a chemical imbalance when you don't know what the balance is. So how can you know that there's an imbalance? It's the same concept, just history repeating itself. People say, oh, history's not repeating itself. It is, because people don't see the change of face. You know, the actors change, the backdrops change. Hippocrates also thought that the womb, the uterus, our whole pelvic area as women, was the source of our emotions, and that it wandered. And if it wandered too far, that it would cause hysteria. And that notion, see how it kind of becomes a telephone game? Like people hear one thing and that ignites a fire and they're like, oh, if that's true, then this must be true. And they just run with it. And there wasn't exactly regulation back in those days, similar to now. Things are far from perfect now, and it's a huge mistake to assume that we've got it all figured out now. Most stuff, doctors do not have figured out at all. So yeah, the notion of our wandering uterus led to the concept of hysteria, which that was first written about in an Egyptian text around 1900 BC, way before Aristotle, 1500 years before Aristotle. And hysteria was frequently diagnosed all the way up to, at least the mid-20th century. And in fact, I've got a textbook here, the Oxford Textbook of Psychiatry. Before I touch on that, I want to share what the DSM-2 says about hysteria, because in DSM-3, they took out hysteria, and that was in 1980. But in 1983, Oxford Textbook of Psychiatry, there's a huge section on hysteria. So it was still carrying on, even though the official psychiatry manual from the APA, the DSM, which if you haven't listened to previous episodes of the show, specifically about the DSM, you need to. It's worth it. This is just the tip of the iceberg, scratching the surface, and it bothers me, you know? I try to keep these podcasts to about 40 minutes, less than an hour for sure. It bothers me that there's so many more textbooks out there that I can get even more nuggets out of, but I can't fit it all into an hour. And, you know, I don't get paid to do this. This is very much a passion project for me, and I try to do at least one episode a week, 3 episodes a month, really, because I take a week off to honor my cycle now, which is something that I know I'll not regret doing, you know, really following my body's energy and needs and not pushing myself to create in times of the month where the energy is being used elsewhere to renew my whole body so I can perform at my best in the times where that's what my body wants to do, you know, and working with my body instead of against it has been awesome. So yeah, I have bookmarked the page in the DSM-2. It's page 39. It's under the section 4, neuroses, and it starts giving, you know, the diagnostic codes. Anxiety, it says, is the chief characteristic of the neuroses. It may be felt and expressed directly, or it may be controlled unconsciously and automatically by conversion, displacement, and various other psychological mechanisms. And I will tell you what conversion means when we get to the psychiatry textbook. I don't want to misquote anything, but it's not, conversion surgery or anything like that you may be familiar with from today's society. Okay, so we'll skip down to hysterical neurosis. This neurosis is characterized by an involuntary psychogenic loss or disorder of function. Symptoms characteristically begin and end suddenly in emotionally charged situations. Whoa. And are symbolic of the underlying conflicts. Sounds a lot like what I experienced. So if I had gone through what I've been through in the last 4 years, specifically, I'm thinking 2018 through 2020, lots of nonsense went down. I shouldn't say nonsense. It all makes sense now. But emotional upheaval with my divorce and just that emotional suppression and explosion. If this had been like the 1960s, 70s, anytime before that, even into the 1980s, according to this textbook, I could have been diagnosed with hysteria. And there are a lot of stories, underground stories. These are not widely publicized, but they have lived on. Stories of women have lived on that instead of divorcing them, because that was such a no-no in societies of yesteryear, that their husbands would just act like they were crazy. And that's where the term gaslighting came from that movie, where a man purposely made a woman feel crazy so he could have her committed instead of getting divorced. I don't think that's actually what happened in the movie, but that was a known strategy of cowardly men back in those days who were afraid to get divorced or didn't know how to treat their woman and chose to make it out to be her fault. Like, she's going crazy. She needs psychiatric care. And back in those days, you could be committed for life. It was fucking terrifying. I think about how horrible it felt to be in the mental hospitals that I was in and not know when I was going to be let out, and knew that I didn't have the power that I should have. In fact, I spent a lot of time on the phone with victim advocacy. They give you those numbers, but then they threaten you if you're on the phone with them too long, trying to report them, that you're going to get your phone privileges taken away. And this has only happened in one of the places I was at. They only let you be on the phone, like the whole place, everybody in the place, there's only 1 hour of phone time a day. And so you have to share the phone with so many other people that you don't have time to actually do the things you need to do that you supposedly have rights to do. It's terrifying. So I can only imagine how, like, knowing that you got thrown into the mental hospital and basically your life was over because somebody else decided that they were going to put you away, and they did it. I feel like maybe that happened to me in a past life, and that was living inside of me, like that kind of betrayal from another man in my past or something, like in a past life, if you believe in reincarnation, like that was living in my body. And that's why it felt so familiar when I got that phone call from my friend who was like, yeah, I talked to your husband at the time who wanted to make me silent partner in the business. And, he was public enemy number one at that point, when I thought he wanted to leave me in there, and I had to beg him to come all the way back to Texas from Florida because I couldn't get out without him. And I was genuinely afraid that he was not going to do that, because it was a good opportunity for him to take everything. It was. From a financial standpoint, that's exactly what he did. But hey, I can't say if I weren't in the same situation, I wouldn't have done the same thing. It happened, and we're here now. So yeah, then there's the hysterical neurosis conversion type. In the conversion type, the special senses or voluntary nervous system are affected, causing such symptoms as blindness, deafness, turning the page, anosmia. All right, we're Googling this. Loss of smell. Oh, that's creative. Anosmia. Anesthesias, paresthesias, paralysis, ataxias, echinesias, and dyskinesias, having to do with body movements or lack thereof. Often, the patient shows an inappropriate lack of concern about these symptoms, which may actually provide secondary gains by winning him sympathy or relieving him of unpleasant responsibilities. This type of hysterical neurosis must be distinguished from psychophysiologic disorders, which are mediated by the autonomic nervous system, from malingering, which is done consciously, and from neurological lesions, which cause anatomically circumscribed symptoms. Then there's hysterical neurosis dissociative type, where alterations may occur in the patient's state of consciousness or in his identity to produce such symptoms as amnesia, somnambulism, I have no idea how to pronounce this word, and multiple personality. So we got some Googling to do here. Somnambulism means sleepwalking. Okay, I feel like sometimes I've never heard this word before. I did research for this episode, and I saw it a couple times when I was highlighting the book, but getting on the show, saying this, somnambulism. Makes sense. I see the roots, but why not just say sleepwalking? I swear that psychiatry is the king of BS language to make something sound like something it's not, to make it sound more official, that's how they manipulate language. They do it that way. Fugue, I don't even know how to pronounce that. We're going to listen to it. It's just fugue. In psychiatry, it's a state or period of loss of awareness of one's identity, often coupled with flight from one's usual environment, associated with certain forms of hysteria and epilepsy. Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, luckily I didn't get diagnosed with hysteria because science has finally realized that it doesn't exist. But it has not been a very long time that wasn't the case. And now there are hundreds of other disorders that encompass a lot of the same symptoms as hysteria. Mostly anxiety, depression, bipolar. I would say those are the top 3 diagnoses that are handed out when there are oftentimes underlying causes. Looking at this 1983 Oxford Textbook of Psychiatry, I found it on eBay. Big surprise. There was a big section on hysteria, and it says the essence of hysteria is that there are symptoms and signs of disease with 3 characteristics. 1, they occur in the absence of physical pathology. It means there's nothing underlying physically that they know of, right? But they're saying it as if it's a fact. They are produced unconsciously. And 3, they are not caused by overactivity of the sympathetic nervous system. And it says those characteristics make it difficult in clinical practice because physical pathology can not often be excluded completely when a patient is first seen. Quote, it is for this reason that the diagnosis of hysteria must often be provisional when first made. The difficulties in diagnosis led Slater, which they didn't specify who Slater was, at least not in this section, in 1965 to suggest that hysteria should be abandoned as a diagnostic category. And eventually that happened. Of course, there wasn't anything on the news that said disorder that was believed to exist for more than 2,000 years no longer actually exists. They just changed the name of things. That's what they're doing. They've been doing that, making it sound more official. They're learning more about marketing and how to convince people and brainwash them. I'm going to prove it to you. Just wait. Epidemiology says the lifetime prevalence of hysteria in the general population is difficult to determine, but is probably between 3 and 6 per 1,000 for women and substantially lower for men. They give a reference from like a 1980 text. I just cannot stand it when a scientific book like this, so-called scientific book, right? It's a textbook of psychiatry, which they believe, erroneously, is real science, that they're saying it's difficult to determine, but they basically don't know what they're going to guess. 3 to 6 people per 1,000 women and substantially lower for men. They don't give a number for that. It says that most cases begin before the age of 35 and few new cases appear after 40. In reading medical medium, it's around that same age that your liver has weakened so much because of viruses and stress that's when symptoms of mystery illnesses, including anxiety and depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, other types of chronic illness, other types of so-called mental illnesses start to pop up. Like for me, it was around age 30. Although hysterical symptoms commonly occur as part of some other disorder well beyond this age. Real specific. I appreciate it. Okay, clinical picture says the variety of symptoms in hysteria is very great. Somebody who didn't go to English class and learn that there are other words to use instead of very great. It's funny. Okay, here we go. The term, I promised you I told you what conversion means. The term conversion stems from Freud's theory that mental energy can be converted into certain physical symptoms. A less controversial nomenclature or naming system divides the symptoms of hysteria into mental and physical. The mental symptoms include amnesia, fugue, behavior like that of a major mental illness, and multiple personality. The physical symptoms include paralysis, fits, aphonia, disorder of gait, anesthesia, blindness, deafness, and abdominal pain. Sounds like neurological symptoms having to do with viruses. Although hysterical symptoms are not produced deliberately, they are created around the patient's ideas about illness. Sometimes the symptoms imitate those of a relative or friend who has been ill. Sometimes they originate in the patient's own experience of ill health. For example, hysterical memory loss may appear in someone who has had a previous head injury. I don't think that has anything to do with being hysterical. Further down, it says the symptoms of hysteria usually offer some advantage for the patient. Following Freud, hysteria has been said to produce secondary gain. The primary gain is that anxiety arising from a psychological conflict is excluded from the patient's conscious mind. That makes no sense. It says, thus, a woman may be spared the care of an elderly relative, so she wouldn't have to take care of her sick mother, if she develops hysterical paralysis of the arm. Basically, he's saying that they would do it on purpose. Patients with hysterical symptoms often show less than the expected amount of distress, a state sometimes called belle indifference, following French writers of the 19th century. And that was actually in the DSM as well, where it said often the patient shows an inappropriate lack of concern about their symptoms, and that would actually provide the secondary gains by winning him. I don't like the male pronouns, especially since hysteria was most often plaguing women, right? Winning him sympathy or relieving him of unpleasant responsibilities. It says the patient with hysteria may be unconcerned by his symptoms, but often shows exaggerated emotional reactions in other ways. It's wild. This just goes on and on and on. There's mental symptoms and amnesia, sleepwalking, multiple personality, pseudo-dementia, memory loss and behavior, gastrointestinal symptoms as a symptom of hysteria, including complaints of abdominal discomfort, farting, so flatulence, and regurgitation. They say that repeated vomiting may be a symptom, but should only be made as a diagnosis after thorough investigation to exclude physical causes. So it says vomiting may be a symptom of emotional disturbance and is sometimes classified as hysterical. And so what's interesting is reflecting back on my experiences with being diagnosed with these so-called mental illnesses. I was not presented with any proof that they exist. I was just told that based on the doctor's evaluation that I have them. They did test my blood. There's so many different blood tests, right? But blood tests don't show proof of the existence of mental illness. They don't. And so I'm left with this feeling that they take blood just to say they did a thorough evaluation when clearly they didn't. It took me from 2018, when I started seeing my general practitioner in March 2018, until May of this year, 2022. So 4 years to finally get to the bottom of why I was having so many neurological symptoms and the brain fog, the fatigue, the intense anxiety, and it was the Epstein-Barr virus. 4 years to get there. After multiple diagnoses, not just with mental illnesses, but physical illnesses, being prescribed over a dozen different medications, including chemo, multiple antipsychotics and antidepressants. It's so scary to think if I had trusted these people that think they know when they don't, and they don't know how much they don't know, and they think, oh, just experiment with drugs and eventually we'll find one that works. It's just, no. It just makes no sense, and it's terrifying to think that they believe it does, and that so many of us have been conditioned to believe them over ourselves and our own inner knowing. I knew that something else was wrong. I knew. And that there was a way out. I wasn't going to live my life on drugs, suppressing the emotions, essentially. Yeah, you can suppress anxiety. You can mask emotional things. You can mask symptoms of a virus invading your organ systems only for so long. And then your life does not get better. It gets worse because of it. So I, to this day, am incredibly proud of myself for not buying into the bullshit, so to speak. And I hope you don't either. And if you have, then you know that it's not too late to undo it. Further on in this book, there's even a section on variations of the syndrome of hysteria. There's a section called epidemic hysteria that most often occurs in closed groups of young women. For example, a girls' school, a nurse's home, or a convent. Usually anxiety has been heightened by a threat to the community, like the possibility of being involved in an epidemic of actual physical disease. Sound familiar? People went crazy when they were afraid of COVID. They went crazy, but nobody got diagnosed as hysterical. They were just trying to do the right thing for their community by acting out of fear. Sad. Typically, the epidemic starts in one person who is highly suggestible, histrionic, and a focus of attention in the group. Yeah. And there's culture and variations of hysteria. Certain patterns of behavior are found in particular cultures. I like that this book, I can give it some credit here. I like that this book does talk about other cultures and they give a lot of information about hysteria. They don't just present it as something simple and say, give people a drug if they have this. Like, they tried, they put in some valiant effort. I don't see that same amount of effort in today's psychiatrists, and I'm speaking from experience. This information is critical to know, and I wasn't told when I was told I had bipolar disorder, 1 or 2 or unspecified, whichever, depending on what time and which doctor. I wasn't told that it could have an organic cause. I was told that it was lifelong. And that's exactly to this day, as we went over in the last episode, to this day, the National Institute of Mental Health website says that it's a lifelong condition and they don't know the exact cause. And in the name of Aristotle, the father of logic, right? It does not make any sense to say that there is no possibility for recovery, right? That it's a lifelong illness. That's basically what they're saying, is that you cannot recover from bipolar disorder, that it's lifelong, but it's not logical at all to say that if you don't know the cause. Culture and variations of hysteria, Lata, which is found among women in Malaya. I don't even know where that is. Is that even still a country? Let's look it up. It's British Malaya. It's a set of states on the Malay Peninsula. It's now Malaysia. Okay. It became Malaysia in 1963. But the book they were quoting was written in 1951, so that's funny they didn't update it to be Malaysia. It no longer exists. Usually begins after a sudden, frightening experience. Hey, that also sounds familiar. Amok has been described among men in Malaya. This was from a source dated 1927. It begins with a period of brooding, which is followed by violent behavior and sometimes dangerous use of weapons. Arctic hysteria is seen among the Eskimo. This was from a source dated 1963. More often in the women, where the affected person tears off her clothing, screams and cries, runs about wildly, and may endanger her life by exposure to cold. Probably because she was pissed about being an Eskimo. If male Eskimos think they're superior to female Eskimos, women are going to feel that, and they're going to be pissed about it. They're not going to know how to express themselves because they were trained to suppress their emotions. The textbook goes on to say that the diagnosis of hysteria can be mistaken in 3 ways. First, that the symptoms may be those of physical disease. So it doesn't say this in the DSM. Of course, psychiatrists aren't going to look this stuff up and read before they prescribe a pill, not in 10 minutes, Secondly, undiscovered brain disease may, in some unknown way, release hysterical symptoms. For example, a small tumor in the frontal or parietal lobe, or an early dementia. Thirdly, physical disease may provide a non-specific stimulus to hysterical elaboration of symptoms by a patient of histrionic personality. The greatest difficulty arises in distinguishing it from organic disease of the central nervous system. Hysteria is provoked by stress. If no stress can be found, the diagnosis is in serious doubt. It is therefore important to question other informants. What is this, crime investigation? Since the patient may not reveal stressful circumstances of which he feels ashamed. On the other hand, it is essential to remember that finding stressors does not prove the diagnosis of hysteria or bipolar, because they often precede physical illness as well. Yeah, stress is the underlying cause of nearly all illnesses, and that is fact. Your lifestyle can cause stress on the body, stress on the mind, lowers the immune system, allows viruses and bacteria to procreate, take over your body systems, and make you feel like shit, and cause disease. It's literally what happens. I'm not making this up. I don't have to be a doctor to know that that's true. Fast forwarding a few pages, there's a section on treatment of hysteria. It says, the general approach is to focus on the elimination of factors that are reinforcing the symptoms and on the encouragement of normal behavior. Damn, I gotta find the section that outlines normal behavior. It says, it should be explained to the patient that he has a disability, which is not caused by physical disease, but by psychological factors. That's helpful. It's often helpful to explain the disorder as due to a blocking of the psychological process between the patient's intention to move his arm, for example, and the nervous mechanisms that bring about movement. He should then be told that if he tries hard to regain control, he will succeed. Oh man, basically lie to the patient. It's crazy. Not tell them that we don't know what's wrong. Tell them that they have hysteria and encourage them to not have it anymore. It's such bullshit. But they write with such authority here. I have to give them some props. Surprisingly, in the same section about treatment, it says medication has no part to play in the treatment of hysteria unless the hysterical symptoms are secondary to a depressive illness or anxiety neurosis requiring treatment in its own right. Specific methods of behavior therapy are also of little value. Those who do not improve should be reviewed thoroughly for undiscovered physical illness. With simple treatment, most patients with hysteria improve, unless there is a strong motivation to remain ill. It's crazy. Y'all, this is crazy. The next section is about hypochondriasis, being a hypochondriac. I've been called a hypochondriac before, but I was right. There was something wrong the whole time. I know how it feels to be told that you're crazy when you know something's not right. So hysteria, you may have guessed, comes from a Greek word. The Greek word for uterus, actually, hystera, and it was the diagnosis that was given to any woman who experienced so-called nervous troubles. And that could be irritability, excitability, depression, or just being pissed off. Things that women experienced that men found uncomfortable or overwhelming. They didn't respect women, right? They really believed that women were less important than men, and that belief informed their understanding and treatment of what women were experiencing. So the symptoms, again, like anxiety, melancholy or depression, bursts of emotion, just being really mad all of a sudden, right? Men perceived this as happening suddenly. And yeah, there were some women undoubtedly that knew they could get the attention that they craved and deserved and desired from their husbands if they pretended to be ill. So I don't ignore that fact. That was absolutely the case because men believed their wives were property. Headaches, tremors, convulsions, all of these were symptoms of hysteria. There's another, he's not Greek, he's Roman. This guy, a Roman philosopher in AD, almost 500 years after Aristotle, Pliny the Elder, no doubt informed by the Greek philosophers. This philosopher cataloged some of the specific evil powers that were ascribed to the blood of the menses, right? Menstrual blood. And he had an encyclopedia titled Natural History, right? Nowadays, philosophers don't write history books. They don't write science books. But back then, it was accepted. Philosophers were, again, the most respected members of society. So he said that if you touched menstrual blood or contact with menstrual blood, right, it would turn new wine sour. I'm quoting, crops touched by it become barren, seeds in gardens are dried up, the fruit of trees fall off, the edge of steel and the gleam of ivory are dulled, hives of bees die, bronze and iron are at once seized by rust, and horrible smells fill the air. Now it seems like he's just being an asshole writing this, but all he was doing was recording the beliefs that were very pervasive in a lot of cultures around the world at that time and throughout history. And here's a couple of them. I got some notes here. The Maori of New Zealand believed that menstrual blood was a super concentrated concoction of germs. Remember that belief that when we menstruate, we release all these toxins and bad humors or whatever. It was very related to that, and the belief that it's a super concentrated concoction of germs, detoxifying. The May Enga, I'm probably butchering that, of New Guinea, they believed that if you came in contact with a bleeding woman, not just the blood itself, but the woman, it could turn a man's blood black, lay waste to his flesh, drain him of his smarts, and eventually suck the life right out of him. The Tinni Indians of the Yukon Territory believed that a woman who was menstruating could turn a manly man into a girly man. And then there was the Bible. Wasn't much better. Leviticus chapter 15 verses 19 through 33. Now Leviticus is a set of legal documents. People think that it's the word of God and they believe that everything in Leviticus is words that came out of God's mouth. But in doing my research on the history of the Bible and the texts within the Bible, I learned that Leviticus is literally a bunch of legal documents that were used at that time. And it makes it very clear that menstrual blood is very yucky, supremely so. Any woman on her period or a man comes in contact with her or anything that she sat on is officially unclean. That woman has to be kept apart from other people for 7 days. I pulled that out. I went to the Bible Gateway, New Living Translation. All of the translations are up there, but growing up I used New Living Translation a lot, and I looked it up. Leviticus 15, 19 through 33. Whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during that time will be unclean until evening. Doesn't this sound like legal documents? It does not sound like anything God actually said, right? It's so liberating to know. It's so liberating to know that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think there's a reason why these legal documents are included in the so-called Word of God. And if it is divinely inspired, right, it's divinely inspired in a way that it is used and useful to show us what people were like back then as like not a comparison in terms of like value comparison or whatever, but showing us the ways that we're still the same. And how history is repeating itself, because there's so many, even if they're not exactly the same, women are still excluded in certain ways because of these pervasive ideas. Anything on which the woman lies or sits during the time of her period will be unclean. If any of you touch her bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch any object she has sat on, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. This includes her bed or any other object she has sat on. You will be unclean until evening if you touch it. If a man has sexual intercourse with her and her blood touches him, her menstrual impurity will be transmitted to him. Oh shit. He will remain unclean for 7 days, and any bed on which he lies will be unclean. You kind of get the picture. It goes on and on and on. I pulled all the way out through verse 33, and we're only through 24, but yeah, it basically goes on to give instructions on how to wash your clothes and how to get back to being clean from being unclean. And then it says when the woman's bleeding stops, she must count off 7 days. Then she'll be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she must bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and present them to the priest at the entrance of the tabernacle. If this is really the word of God, we're all going to hell because we're disobeying it every month. But this is what people believe. This is what Hebrews believed back then. This is what they believed, and this is their legal documents. And this is the stuff that when Jesus spoke to the Pharisees and the religious zealots of the time, he was oftentimes yelling at them for adhering so tightly to rules just like this. I don't think that there's any record of any specific conversations that Jesus had with religious leaders and zealots about a woman's period, but I imagine that he would make fun of them if that did happen, and maybe it did. But it was so commonly accepted that this was the way it was. The women were unclean when they bled. They didn't understand it. And so they were afraid of it. And this was, centuries and centuries and centuries of this. And the treatment of choice for hysteria was the doctor would use his hands to bring a patient to orgasm. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I had heard about, using orgasm as some kind of therapy years and years ago, but until doing the research on hysteria specifically, I didn't know that they considered it therapeutic to stimulate someone's clitoris. And at that time, it was not considered racy at all. It was basically like bandaging a wound. And I guess you may consider it a good thing that emerged from the hoopla of hysteria. It was the birth of the vibrator. It was called a mechanical stress reliever at the time. I think on Amazon, vibrators are called stress relievers or massage sticks. No, it's so funny. People are afraid of the words. And that was in 1883. There was a British physician named Dr. J.M. Granville. He debuted the first vibrator called a mechanical stress reliever. Women were accused of witchcraft when they acted erratically, and they were, in certain times throughout history, more likely to be labeled a heretic and tried as a witch. And I haven't done an episode on witch trials or witchcraft yet, but I certainly have mentioned it on other episodes because it's all connected, you guys. There's always been some kind of explanation, erroneous explanation about emotional issues, like being possessed by the devil, practicing witchcraft, being a heretic, and by the late 1800s, hysteria had become a full-fledged epidemic, especially among well-to-do American and European women. And hysterectomies started to gain popularity. It was in the late 1800s that rates of elective hysterectomies surged, just completely skyrocketed. And this happened despite the fact that the survival rate of the surgery was only 50%. Most, half of people who went through with the surgery died. One shocking but not shocking part about hysterectomies surging was that it wasn't women who were wanting their parts to be removed. It was husbands who were checking their wives in for the procedure. And it kind of became this reproductive spin on lobotomy where it became involuntary. People were so convinced that a woman's uterus was the cause of her hysteria or her emotional problems that men insisted that they get the organ removed altogether. It's terrifying. I'm so glad I don't live in that era. Another very similarly bizarre, but it was less deadly cure that was out there was this called the rest cure. Women were resting, and that's where the fainting couches became kind of a trend, and it was so common for women to be going through this each month that it became fashionable. Women would take to their day beds and whiff on the smelling salts, and they actually sought and endeavored to look as pale as possible, just looking ghastly. It was kind of a grunge fad back in the day in the late 1800s. And there were even magazine ads for skin lighteners, so you could look even more deathly. It was really considered glamorous. And I did a little research on smelling salts, and they had this type of ammonia in it that would irritate the nose and cause you to suddenly inhale. But it's 1,000% more likely, this is not from my research, it's just obvious, that women who wore the tight corsets and they couldn't freaking breathe and their organ systems were directly affected by that. And of course, the emotional stressors of being suppressed and thought of as property by men who didn't respect, love, or appreciate them, no doubt contributed to hysteria in women. And it was recognized as a disease by the American Psychiatric Association up until 1952, whence it changed to being a type of neurosis, which we went over from the DSM-2. It was still talked about in the 1983 textbook. It takes a long time for stuff like this to die, and legacies continue on as the one of hysteria did. But what was interesting is that hysteria, when it kind of went out of fashion as a term, premenstrual syndrome became part of the daily nomenclature. Ironically, the symptoms included under that umbrella: depression, angry outbursts, irritability, crying spells, anxiety, confusion, social withdrawal, poor concentration, insomnia, increased nap taking, changes in sexual desire, breast tenderness, bloating and weight gain, swelling of the hands, aches and pains, fatigue, skin problems, gastrointestinal symptoms, and abdominal pain. Sound familiar? It all is name changing. It's changing the name and reselling us the same ideas under a different cover. I think that's where we're going to wrap up this episode. I think it's been a good one. What's scary too is with the invention of PMS, there's a lot more to be said about that. And I think I'm going to bring in a friend of mine, Michelle. She's actually my roommate too. She does a lot of work in helping women heal their wombs. I'm working with her right now too. She knows a lot about the history of PMS, and we've both been following a lot of the information from Medical Medium. He has a whole chapter on PMS and premenstrual syndrome and menopause. Michelle's in her 50s. She works with menopausal women and supporting them. She works with all types of women and supporting them. And I'm recently decided I'm going to become board certified as a integrated women's health coach. Which thankfully that profession has gained a lot of traction and more respectability in the climate. I mean, you can now get board certified. It's legitimate. Things have come a long way since I was last in wellness. I was in wellness until about 2014 when I started my online business and kind of transitioned out of the wellness space and into online marketing, business, media. Now I'm going to be combining a lot of the skills that I learned from that industry into growing a new business in wellness. Not with the overarching intent to make a crap ton of money. This is so much more about my passion and my purpose in the world that I've developed because of my pain and tremendous level of understanding and compassion I feel for women who have been through a lot of the same things that I have, who've been misunderstood and disrespected and gaslit, all because doctors have zero understanding of what's actually going on, and they don't have the words "I don't know" in their vocabulary. So one last note I have for today's episode is in regard to the pill, and this is probably a whole nother episode in itself, but definite proof that doctors don't know, and we don't know either because of that. So very little known fact. It's a shocking fact for most people when I share it with them, and that's that in 2005, that was the year I graduated high school, fun fact, the World Health Organization changed their stance on the birth control pill from possibly carcinogenic to carcinogenic to humans. And that made the birth control pill a class 1 carcinogen. If you don't know what carcinogenic means, it means that it causes cancer. It is known to cause cancer. And that's because it's artificial hormones. Hormones feed viruses. Artificial hormones mess with your body's natural cycles, lowering the immune system and allowing viruses to thrive and flourish in your body, affecting its entire function, putting it under a lot of stress and causing the healthy cells to mutate into cancer. And understanding what I understand now, thanks in large part to books I've read and the experiences I've gone through, and of course Medical Medium's information that was just groundbreaking for me, understanding how the body actually works and how viruses are actually a larger part of the disease process and cancer growth process, and of course even mental health than I ever imagined. things have changed a lot, and I was on the pill for 4 years. I was on the pill when I got married. Birth control pills are now what smoking was 40 years ago. Commonplace and accepted, much like many of the diagnoses that we've talked about on the show, much like PMS. Laying the groundwork with this episode for many other episodes in the future. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. This has been episode 9 of Misdiagnosed, the History of Hysteria. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to Misdiagnosed. If this show has helped you in any way, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. Sharing your experience will help others who are lost in the darkness find their own way out of the science of lies. Please note that while I may go in depth into medical topics and have acquired substantial medical knowledge, I am not a medical doctor. I'm a researcher. I'm a messenger of hope for other survivors of industrialized psychiatry. Because of how toxic psychiatric drugs are, it can be extremely dangerous, even life-threatening, to suddenly stop taking certain drugs. This is especially true for antidepressants, antipsychotics, and benzodiazepines. The longer you've taken the drug, the more dangerous withdrawal can be. If you want to heal your brain and soul naturally, the way it was designed to do, please seek the help of a compassionate and patient-centered physician to start the process of withdrawing from them as safely as possible. It will take time for your brain to reacclimate to life without the drugs, and there are doctors out there who will support you in your quest to save your brain. Never give up. You can heal.